In 1995, two brothers disappeared on their way home from school in a quiet Indiana town. For 25 years, no trace of them was ever found until a construction crew unearthed their rusted bikes beneath a middle school parking lot. What followed uncovered decades of buried secrets and something far more disturbing than anyone expected. The sky was cloudless that afternoon in early October 1995. That sort of rare, crisp fall day in Wabrook, Indiana, where the trees were still full of flame-red leaves and the sun sat just warm enough to make kids forget about jackets. 12-year-old Derek McCall and his 10-year-old brother Mason biked home from Wabrook Middle School the same way they did every Monday, their matching red bikes squeaking slightly as they cut through the sidewalk cracks. Their backpacks bounced against their shoulders with each bump, and Mason, slightly smaller, always trailing behind, called out, "Wait up," for the third time in 2 blocks. Derek rolled his eyes. "If you pedaled instead of yelling, we'd be home by now." They cut across the back lot of the school, past the dumpsters and loading zone, taking the shortcut between the gymnasium and the old brick maintenance shed. That path wasn't meant for students, but everyone used it. It shaved 3 minutes off the ride home. And the principal, Mr. Corrigan, had never really enforced the no-student rule back there. That was the last place they were seen. At 3:43 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing 2 kids laughing and the squeal of tires against gravel. Another neighbor, Mrs. Lenz, saw 2 boys on bikes crossing Pine Street toward the trail entrance by the overgrown fence. They never made it home. By 5:30, their mother, Karen McCall, had called every house on the block. By 6:15, their father was driving the streets in slow circles. At 7:00, they called the police. By midnight, the town of Wabrook had changed. Search parties launched at dawn. Police and volunteers scoured the wooded lots, culverts, and back roads. The nearby riverbank was searched for signs of a fall or accident. Helicopters circled for 2 days. Police dogs were brought in from Indianapolis. Not a single shred of clothing, not a backpack, not a bike tire mark was ever found past Pine Street. It was as if the boys had pedaled into thin air. Detectives interviewed everyone at the school. Teachers, coaches, groundskeepers. No one saw the boys leave. No one saw them linger. No one saw anything out of place. At least that's what they said. Rumors spread as they always do in small towns. Some said the boys had run away, though no one believed it. Others whispered darker things, that they'd been taken by someone passing through, maybe someone who had watched them before. A trucker, a drifter. One woman, old Mrs. Gates, claimed she saw lights over the woods that night. Not headlights, she insisted. Up in the sky. Spinning. Most ignored her. By Halloween, the search was over. Flyers turned yellow on telephone poles. Police released a composite sketch of a man seen near the school 2 days prior, short-hair denim jacket. But no one came forward. The sketch led nowhere. The man was never found. The McCalls kept their porch light on every night for the next 3 years. They never changed the boys' rooms. Eventually, the case went cold. The town moved on or learned how to pretend. Wabrook Middle School got a new principal. The maintenance shed was torn down in 2002. A new blacktop lot was poured in its place, turning the back alley shortcut into a staff-only parking zone. No one used the area much after that, until 25 years later. In the spring of 2020, the school approved a new digital learning center. Contractors arrived to begin demolition on the old asphalt. And early one morning, just after sunrise, a backhoe cut into the pavement and hit something that crunched. Not rock, not pipe. Metal. 2 bikes. Red. Rusted nearly to dust, mangled and twisted together like they'd been buried in a hurry. The construction crew halted work. Police were called. The lot was cordoned off. By noon, the town of Wabrook was holding its breath again. The discovery made national headlines within 24 hours. The serial number on one bike matched Derek McCall's registration from 1995. The other was Mason's. The town was stunned. For 25 years, everyone had searched outside the school grounds, never beneath them. How had they ended up there? Who put them there? And what else might still be below? The bikes were sent to a forensics lab in Indianapolis. Soil samples were collected from beneath the pavement. Beneath 6 inches of asphalt and 4 inches of compacted gravel, investigators found a layer of disturbed clay. One detective on site, a young officer who hadn't been alive when the McCall boys vanished, asked the same question every other officer was suddenly thinking. If the bikes are here, he didn't finish the sentence. Word spread through Wabrook faster than fire through dry leaves. By that evening, the parking lot behind the school was surrounded by yellow tape camera crews and townspeople who hadn't spoken the McCall boys' names aloud in years. Karen and Doug McCall, now divorced, living in different towns, arrived separately, each standing in stunned silence as investigators loaded the rusted bikes into the back of a state vehicle. Karen cried quietly behind her sunglasses. Doug stared at the ground, his fists clenched tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Inside the school, Principal Larson tried to maintain calm. Classes were still in session, but the building felt different now, quieter, colder, like the walls had exhaled something they'd been holding in for decades. Detective Madeline Greer was assigned to lead the reopened investigation. She was young, methodical, and had read the old case file so many times she could quote it from memory. The discovery of the bikes cracked the story open, and she was determined to pry it apart. She stood over the site where the backhoe had struck metal. Soil samples were being collected, sifted carefully for remains, clothing fibers, or any fragment that might lead to answers. So far, nothing else had turned up. Greer turned her attention to the original case file again. The last known witness, Mrs. Lentz, had described the boys turning toward the trail near the maintenance shed. But the bikes had been found just 30 feet away from that path, directly beneath what had become the corner of the staff parking lot. In 1995, it had been a gravel lot and fenced storage area mostly unused, so why had no one searched there? Greer flipped to the 1995 interview logs. The maintenance shed had been locked. No reports of break-ins, no signs of struggle. The groundskeeper, a man named Frank Cormer, had given a brief interview and moved away 6 months after the boys vanished. She made a note to track him down. Back at the lab in Indianapolis, the bikes were undergoing close examination. Despite the corrosion, technicians found something unexpected on Mason's bike. The front brake lever had a smear of old dried blood lodged deep beneath the metal housing. A forensic swab confirmed it as human type O, the same type as Mason. But that wasn't the disturbing part. On Derek's handlebars underneath a layer of rust, the team found scratch marks, tiny, uneven gouges. At first, they looked like random damage, but under magnification, the pattern was unmistakable. Fingernail marks, as if someone had clutched the handlebars in a final moment of panic, digging in with every ounce of strength they had. Greer reviewed the photos, heart thudding. These weren't the markings of an abandoned bike tossed aside by 2 boys who ran off. These were signs of struggle, signs of fear. The blood sample was sent for DNA confirmation. Meanwhile, the construction team was ordered to halt all work on the lot indefinitely. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. A full excavation was scheduled. Whatever had been buried here once could be buried still. As the equipment scanned deeper into the earth, something else was found, a second anomaly 2 feet below the bikes. Roughly rectangular, slightly distorted by decades of pressure. At first they thought it might be a crate, a container. But as the soil was brushed away, something more chilling emerged. A shoe, faded red canvas, child-sized, torn at the laces, and near it a piece of deteriorated cloth that looked suspiciously like a backpack strap. Greer stood over the discovery site, nausea tightening her throat. "Is it them?" one officer whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she called for a forensic team to begin a careful, layered dig. It took 4 days. By the end, they'd unearthed one child's shoe, fragments of a nylon backpack, A rusted keychain in the shape of a football, a torn scrap of notebook paper with faded math problems in pencil, all consistent with the McCall brothers' possessions. But no remains, no bones, no teeth. Nothing that could explain how two boys, their bikes, and their belongings had ended up under a school parking lot without a single witness trace or sound. That's when an anonymous tip came in. It was a voicemail left on the school's main line after hours. The voice was male, elderly, shaky. They never left the school, the voice said. It was under the gym. You check under the gym. That's where it started. That's where they screamed. Then silence. Greer had the call traced. The number was registered to a disconnected line from a trailer park, 20 miles outside Wabrook. The trailer had burned down in 2007, and yet, the message had been recorded just hours before. Detective Madeline Greer stood beneath the pale, fluorescent lights of the Wabrook police station's records room, surrounded by the hum of old printers and the muffled rattle of file drawers. The air smelled like stale paper and ink. She rubbed her temple as she reviewed the voicemail transcript again. It was under the gym. That's where it started. That's where they screamed. Greer didn't believe in ghosts, not in the traditional sense. But a message from a number disconnected for 13 years was hard to classify as anything but unnatural. She had the voice analyzed. No match to any prior interviewees from the original case. No match in the state's offender database. Too distorted and aged for voice recognition to go further. Still, she had a new lead: the gym. Back at Wabrook Middle School, the gymnasium was a squat brick building attached to the main wing by a narrow hallway. It had been built in 1972, long before the McCall brothers disappeared. Records showed several renovations in the late 80s and early 90s, mostly cosmetic. A newer roof, updated bleachers, some HVAC work. Nothing unusual. But when Greer requested the original blueprints, something did stand out. There was a room listed in the 1972 architectural documents that no longer appeared in the current plans. Labeled M04 Sub-Maintenance Access. No square footage, no adjacent rooms. Just a lonely rectangle beneath the gym floor near the east wall. Greer frowned. Why would they remove that from the updated maps? She called facilities. The head custodian, Kevin Roach, was in his late 50s, quiet, meticulous. He'd been with the school since 1999. "I've never seen anything like that," Roach said, tapping the old blueprint. "We don't have a sub-level under the gym. Just a crawl space for ducts. Maybe 3 feet tall tops. No standing room." Greer raised an eyebrow. "Would you help me check anyway?" That afternoon, the two of them entered the gym. It was quiet. PE classes had been canceled during the investigation. Dust filtered through the sunbeams coming in through high windows. Greer noticed how the east wall, where the mystery room would be located, had a slightly different shade of brick, newer than the rest. Roach opened the access panel in the equipment room. A musty smell hit them immediately, like damp stone and iron. He crouched and shined a flashlight into the crawl space. "There's no access here, just pipes." Greer didn't reply. Instead, she walked along the east wall, tapping as she went. Most spots echoed with solid hollowness, but near the far corner, directly behind the climbing rope racks, the sound changed thicker. Denser. Roach joined her. Together, they removed the equipment and found what looked like an old plaster wall patch square, and just a bit darker than the brick. Greer crouched. Someone had painted over a seam. "We need clearance to remove this," Roach said nervously. Greer didn't wait. With a multi-tool, she chipped away at the edge until it cracked. Behind it was a thin wood panel, rotten and splintering. A second layer. She dug her fingers in, pried the panel back, and found a door handle. "Jesus Christ," Roach whispered. It was old, iron, rusted. The wood around it flaked with rot. Greer pulled gently. It groaned open into total darkness. A steep stairwell dropped into the floor. The smell hit them both like a wave, damp, metallic, a touch of mildew, and something older, sourer. like time itself had been trapped down there and left to rot. Greer clicked on her flashlight. Stone steps descended into darkness, lined with flaking white tiles and spiderwebs. They called for backup before entering. When officers arrived, they descended as a team. The space below was cold unnaturally so considering the warm October afternoon above. Their breath fogged in the beam of their lights. The stairwell opened into a wide chamber, maybe 20 by 20 feet. The walls were tiled, though many had crumbled. The floor was concrete, cracked and spotted with black mold. Rusted metal shelves lined the walls, some still holding ancient boxes labeled boiler maint and chem storage. A metal desk sat in the center of the room, knocked over, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. But what stopped them was what was painted on the far wall. A symbol, large, faded, spray-painted in dull black. A circle surrounding two interlocked triangles, one upright, one inverted, with a spiral running through the center. Greer snapped photos, her skin crawling. Roach stepped back pale. "I've never seen that in my life." On the floor next to the desk, they found a pile of burned tape reels and 3 VHS cassettes, partially melted and fused together. But one was intact enough to still have a label. Gymcam Desta 3, D5. Greer bagged it immediately and signaled for evidence collection. On the far side of the room, another door. This one led into a narrow passage lined with exposed insulation and moldy wood. The floor dipped as they moved forward, and water squelched beneath their boots. Rodents scurried. The walls seemed to press inward, like the structure itself was resisting their intrusion. Finally, they reached a metal hatch bolted from the inside. Roach tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Greer ran her hand along the wall and felt a series of shallow vertical marks. She leaned in with the flashlight. Fingernail gouges. Again, someone had tried to claw their way out. Later that night, Greer had the VHS tape transferred and digitized. She watched it in a dark room alone. The first few minutes were nothing grainy gym footage. Empty bleachers, a janitor mopping near the east wall. Then at 3:41 p.m., the footage flickered. 2 boys on bikes rode past the gym windows. Seconds later, the camera jolted. A shadow moved across the lower corner of the frame, tall, fast. Then static, then black. The tape ended. But in the final 2 seconds, as the screen faded out, a distorted frame lingered. A flash of the symbol on the wall. And something else. Something standing in the gym, shadows facing the camera. It had no face. Detective Greer replayed the VHS transfer again and again, scrubbing frame by frame through the final seconds. Each time her breath hitched when the figure emerged, tall, indistinct, standing in the shadows near the gym's east wall. The lack of facial detail was unnerving, but there was something off about its proportions. Its arms hung too low. The legs were bent strangely, like a person crouched inside a costume that didn't quite fit. She tried enhancing the image, but the analog video degraded under digital strain. The more she sharpened the exposure, the more the figure distorted until finally she had to look away. The VHS tapes were sent to a forensic media analyst in Indianapolis. Greer returned to the tunnel. This time they brought ground-penetrating radar and structural engineers. The metal hatch they'd found the previous day was carefully unbolted. Rusted threads snapped one by one until the door gave way with a deep groan. It opened into a small cinder-block room, maybe 8 feet across. The smell inside was worse than anything before, like iron and wet ash. The walls were lined with soundproofing foam. A single folding chair sat in the center of the floor. Chains lay at its base, cut through. A small strip of duct tape remained curled on the floor nearby. Greer froze. This was a holding room, she whispered. This was meant to keep someone in. They swept the space for evidence. In the far corner, a rusted drain was clogged with hair too long and dark to belong to either boy. DNA would take time. Still, it confirmed what Greer had feared: someone had been held here. And the signs of claw marks on the wall, partially hidden by foam insulation, suggested they hadn't gone quietly. On the underside of the folding chair, someone had carved something in jagged block letters. "Stop looking." Greer felt a chill spread down her arms. Outside the tunnel, news crews swarmed the school's perimeter. Rumors were spreading. Internet sleuths had already matched the newly discovered symbol on the wall to obscure conspiracy threads and an archived forum called the Eighth Spiral. It had been inactive since 2004, but users were now pulling screenshots, decoding symbols, and claiming that Wabrook Middle School sat atop a forgotten grid site. Greer didn't care for theories. She wanted facts. One came later that afternoon. Frank Cormer, the school janitor from 1995, had been found. He was living in Michigan under his legal name, now 76 years old. A request for questioning was approved, and Greer drove north the next day. Cormer lived in a rundown bungalow near Flint. His front porch sagged, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. He answered the door in a stained bathrobe, clearly expecting no one. When Greer introduced herself, his eyes flicked to her badge, then down to her notebook. "I knew this day'd come," he muttered. He didn't resist. Inside, he made coffee and sat on a ratty couch while Greer recorded the interview. "I didn't take those boys," he said before she even asked. "But I saw something. I saw where they went." Greer waited. "In the weeks before they disappeared, I kept hearing noises under the gym," he continued. "Footsteps, scraping, sometimes humming. Late at night. I thought it was just pipes, or kids screwing around." "What happened the day they vanished?" she asked. Cormer rubbed his temple. "I was mopping near the gym. Saw the boys ride by. They took the shortcut past the loading dock. That's normal, right? But then I heard something strange." "What kind of strange?" He hesitated. "A scream," he said. "But not a child's. Lower. Like a vibration in the wall." Cormer swallowed hard. "I went to check the boiler room. The door was open. That never happens. It's supposed to be locked. Was someone down there? I don't know. I never made it in. The air, it was wrong, like standing next to a power line. And you didn't report this." He laughed bitterly. To who the Principal Corrigan was worse than the silence. "He told me never to go down there again. Said the room under the gym was sealed for a reason." Greer sat up. "You mean he knew about the sub-room?" "He knew a lot of things." Cormer leaned in, whispering now. "You ever ask yourself why they repaved the parking lot 6 months after the boys went missing?" She blinked. "What?" "They tore up the gravel lot, said it was for drainage, poured new asphalt. No one questioned it. But I remember there was a day the whole back lot was off limits. Corrigan was out there with 2 men I'd never seen before. Suits, not cops. FBI?" He shook his head. "No badges. They didn't speak to anyone. Just stood there, watching." Greer left the interview in a fog. She called the school district archives, requested copies of all renovation permits from 1995 to 1996, and there it was. A line item from February 1996, asphalt replacement, Wabrook Middle School rear lot. Approved under a discretionary grant from an unnamed educational foundation. The payment had come from a bank account routed through 3 shell organizations. The final name on the paper trail was an entity listed as KSR Holdings Limited. Greer Googled it. No website, no public records. But it had appeared once in a 2002 legal case involving hush money and a sealed deposition. The location, West Virginia, less than 100 miles from Wabrook. And when she searched the name KSR with the phrase Eighth Spiral, a match popped up. An old image board thread long deleted, but archived where a user named Nullwatcher posted a message in 2003. "Don't dig under the spiral. That's where the grid breathes. KSR sealed 1. There are others." Greer stared at the screen. The symbol on the wall in the gym wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Greer returned to Wabrook under a sky bruised with cloud. Rain streaked the windshield as she drove past the old feed store, the shuttered bowling alley, and the playground where the McCall boys had once ridden their bikes. The town hadn't changed much since 1995, but she had. The more she peeled back the story, the more rot she found beneath the surface. That night, she sat alone in the evidence room reviewing the tapes from the gym tunnel again. There were still 2 partially melted cassettes. The forensic team had managed to salvage fragments from one, most of it static, but in between the noise, a few seconds of warped footage emerged. A figure, sitting in the chair, face obscured. Then, movement in the corner of the frame, not from the subject, from the walls. The insulation shifted. A shadow moved along it. The image glitched. Then the footage cut. The lab tech didn't want to speculate. There was interference, but not from age, he said. More like a frequency distortion, could be magnetic, or not. Greer wasn't sure what or not meant. What she was sure of was that someone had gone to great lengths to bury all of this. She went to the school board the next morning and demanded access to every renovation record since 1990. Most of them were routine plumbing, paint, asbestos removal. But in the spring of 1994, one stood out. A structural reinforcement project requested by then-Principal Edwin Corrigan. It had been signed off with unusual urgency and carried no engineering diagrams. Instead, there was a line item labeled South Sub-Basement Boiler Wing Reinforcement and Acoustic Ceiling. The contractor, KSR Holdings Ltd. Corrigan had retired the following year, moved out of town. No forwarding address, but Greer was relentless. She tracked him down to a private elder care community in northern Ohio. Under a different name, Edwin Ross. He'd changed it in 1999. No criminal record, no complaints. But everything about him smelled like a man running from something. She drove 6 hours in one shot, arrived just after sunset. The nurse said he had lucid days and foggy ones. Today's one of the better ones, she said, though he doesn't like talking about his teaching years. Greer introduced herself carefully. He looked up, pale and thinned by time, his eyes still sharp beneath drooping lids. Wabrook, he said before she even spoke the name. Greer nodded. You remember, I never forgot, he whispered. She eased into the conversation. Asked about the school, the tunnels, the rooms beneath the gym. Corrigan's face went hard. It wasn't meant to be found, he said quietly. That sub-chamber was there before the school was built. What do you mean? Greer leaned in. In 1970, when we broke ground, the foundation crew found a hollow space stonework, deep-set tunnels, like something ancient, not natural. The floor vibrated sometimes, especially in spring. Greer felt her pulse rise. You kept it secret. I didn't want to, but the board was contacted. Not by law enforcement, by them, men in gray suits. They said sealing it would be safer. They funded the gym build. But I started hearing things. Like what? Voices. In the ducts. In my dreams. And not just me. Kids said they felt watched during PE classes. One girl had a seizure on the east wall. Said someone was humming inside her head. Greer didn't breathe. And when the McCall boys vanished, she asked softly. Corrigan looked haunted. That was the tipping point. I saw them ride past my office. 15 minutes later, I got a call from the boiler tech. He said something opened. A door that shouldn't exist. He started shaking. I think it took them, he whispered. Not a person, not something with hands, something old, something underneath. It needed voices, energy, witnesses. Greer stood slowly. You never told the police. Corrigan smiled bitterly. Would you have believed me? She left him sitting in the garden atrium, staring into the fountain like it held secrets. On the drive back, Greer tried to reconcile the impossible, but evidence didn't lie. Bikes buried under asphalt, scratch marks in concrete, video distortion in sealed tunnels. Whatever had happened to the McCall brothers, it wasn't simple abduction. It was ritual. Back in Wabrook, Engineers began prepping a ground-penetrating radar scan beneath the gym's east wall. As they ran the equipment, a lead operator called out to Greer. "Hey, this isn't right." She approached. On the screen was a rough 3D rendering of the Earth beneath the gym. The GPR showed something roughly circular, 20 feet beneath the surface, lined with geometric shapes. "Could be old pipes," one tech offered. But Greer saw something else, 7 long shafts extending outward like spokes. A sigil, a wheel. At the center, a chamber. That night, the entire school lost power. Security footage cut out for 7 minutes. When it returned, every camera was angled toward the gym. And on the gym floor in white dust was the symbol again. Fresh, painted from the inside. The air in the gym was thick with silence. Detective Greer stood at the center of the court flashlight beam, dancing over the symbol scrawled in chalky white across the floor. The spiral encased within the interlocked triangles was precisely drawn, almost impossibly symmetrical, like it had been stenciled with mathematical precision. But no one had entered the building. That much had already been confirmed. Security footage showed no motion, no footsteps, no shadows, only a 7-minute blackout. And then suddenly every camera, inexplicably reoriented, pointed toward the center of the gym. Greer crouched beside the mark, gently brushing its edge. The substance wasn't chalk or paint. It felt like fine ash. Her fingers tingled where it touched her skin. "This wasn't a prank," she said aloud, mostly to herself. Facilities swept the building. Every door was locked. No alarms tripped, no windows forced. It was as if the symbol had manifested from the floor itself. Greer had seen enough. She ordered the floor to be removed. The janitor Roach protested, citing cost and safety concerns, but Greer pushed it through with state-level authority. Within 48 hours, the wood panels of the gym's east side were pried up plank by plank. Beneath them lay concrete. Beneath that, more concrete. But then, a seam, a faint octagonal outline in the center of the exposed slab, no more than 4 feet across, barely visible to the naked eye. They used ground-penetrating radar, again targeted this time. A hollow space registered. Roughly circular, 10 feet down. And it wasn't empty. There was movement, not constant, intermittent. Like breath, Greer felt her chest tighten. The team brought in a jackhammer and began careful removal of the center seam. The sound echoed through the halls, drawing a small crowd of faculty, townspeople, and reporters, waiting behind caution tape outside the gym. After 2 hours, the hammer struck metal. They switched to hand tools. Finally, a steel hatch emerged. Round, corroded, and sealed tight with bolts that hadn't been touched in decades. It bore no handles, only a circular indentation in the center, like it was waiting for something. Greer stared at it, then pulled out her phone. She opened her photo archive and brought up the images from the recovered videotape, particularly the shot of the strange figure in the boiler tunnel. Behind it, just barely visible, was a wall etching. A circle with 3 raised notches. She compared it to the hatch. An exact match. That night, Greer dreamed of water. Not flowing, but suspended, black and silent, like the world had been submerged beneath a thick, heavy tide. In her dream, the McCall boys were there, floating just beyond her reach. Eyes open, but unblinking. Behind them, something enormous stirred. It didn't chase her. It waited. She woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the sound of breathing still echoing faintly in her ears. The next day, she returned to the evidence room. Inside, the folder marked, "Recovered Personal Effects." McCall, she found Mason's rusted keychain, the tiny football fob from his backpack. It had corroded almost beyond recognition. But the chain still linked 2 keys, one house, one unknown. Greer held it up beside a photo of the hatch indentation. The second key's flat face bore a matching 3-notch groove. She stared. Impossible. But she had to try. Back at the gym, with the area cleared and documented, she inserted the key into the center groove. It slid in. With a low click, the hatch groaned. Dust blew upward as stale air escaped from below. The steel disc lifted slightly, revealing a darkness so pure It looked like a hole carved into existence. Greer dropped a flare. It tumbled 10 feet down, landing in a small chamber with a dull thud and a flickering red glow. She descended the ladder first. What she found below was worse than she expected. The chamber was a perfect circle, smooth stone walls, no seams. The floor was etched with more symbols worn by time. Dust layered the space like untouched snow, and in the center, illuminated by the dying flare, was a small wooden chair, children's size. Tethered to the chair's legs were 2 broken zip ties, but there was no blood, no clothing. Only one thing remained, a VHS cassette. It sat propped carefully against the back of the chair, as if left for someone. The label read, Mason, 10-2 Greer didn't breathe. She took the tape, sealed it in an evidence bag, and ascended. Once back at the station, she called the media lab and requested an emergency transfer. The team worked through the night. The tape was warped but playable. It opened with static. Then an image emerged. A grainy, flickering frame of Mason McCall sitting in the chair, blinking under harsh overhead light. He looked dazed. His shirt was dirty. His hands trembled. He stared straight at the camera and whispered, "It talks when you're asleep." The tape crackled. A low hum filled the audio. Then Mason again. "It's not a man. It wears people, but it's not a man." Off camera something moved. Mason flinched, then looked back at the camera and said softly, "Don't open the other door." The screen went black. Greer leaned back, numb. The other door, back in the tunnel behind the hidden boiler room, or something deeper. She pulled out the blueprint again. There was another chamber noted in the original 1972 documents, M05, listed without dimensions or labels. Its location, 30 feet under the west wing, directly beneath the school library. And in the original plans, that room was marked with just one word, core. The Wabrook School Library had always felt colder than the rest of the building. Teachers blamed it on old insulation, poor heating. Students joked that it was haunted. Books went missing, lights flickered, but in a building layered with history and grief, no one questioned one more anomaly. Detective Greer stood in the middle of the non-fiction aisle, holding the 1972 blueprint against a modern digital overlay. The spot labeled M05 Core aligned perfectly with the back corner of the library behind the reference shelves. Beneath the floor, no one had touched that area in decades. "Do you feel that roach?" the custodian whispered beside her. Greer looked up. "Feel what?" He held out his hand. It was trembling slightly. "It's like a hum, low, like standing next to a power transformer." Greer nodded. She felt it too. Not in her ears, but in her chest. Subtle, rhythmic, like a second heartbeat, not her own. She instructed Roach to start moving the shelves. Behind them, pressed into the corner, was a panel of wood, unlike the rest of the flooring. It was slightly raised with a ring of nails spaced unevenly around its perimeter. No visible handle. Greer knelt and pressed her palm to it. Warm, unnaturally warm. She called in the structural team, and with their help, the panel was carefully pried up. Beneath it lay a rusted metal trapdoor larger than the hatch beneath the gym. This one was covered in dust and cobwebs untouched. The hinges had fused from corrosion. It took nearly an hour to break the seal. When they finally lifted it, a blast of hot, moist air surged upward, foul with age. Below was a narrow shaft descending straight into blackness. Greer dropped a flare. It tumbled 20, maybe 30 feet before striking stone with a distant clang. Then she heard it, a low drone vibrating up from below. Not mechanical, not natural, living. Against her better instincts, Greer climbed down the metal ladder. The shaft ended in a stone antechamber lined with concentric rings of carving symbols, similar to those seen on the gym wall, but more elaborate. Spirals within spirals, interwoven triangles, and shapes that defied symmetry. In the center of the chamber stood a single podium. On it sat a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels still loaded with brittle magnetic tape. Dust clung to it like fur. Greer approached slowly. Beside the recorder was a clipboard with a yellowed sheet of paper barely legible under the grime. She gently wiped it with a cloth. Site M05, Protocol, Entry, Number 9. October 1st, 1995, Operator Corrigan, Note, Audio Containment Unstable. Subject becoming responsive at 0417 cycle. Voice patterns mimic lost individuals. At the bottom, scrawled in red ink, do not engage. Do not believe. Do not enter core. Greer turned to the tape recorder. She didn't want to play it. She had to. She pressed the play button. The reels stuttered, then began to turn. Static crackled through the chamber. Then a voice, soft, childlike. "Hello, is someone there?" Greer's breath caught. It was Mason. "I don't know where Derek is," the recording continued. "He said it's pretending to be Mom." The static surged. She's not real. Her hands are too long. It's under the floor. It watches through the lights." Another voice joined in, lower, distorted. "You belong to the spiral now." The tape hissed, then stopped. Greer stood frozen. Then something moved behind her. Not a sound, just the pressure in the room changed, as if air had been displaced. She turned. The chamber was empty, but the carvings on the walls were no longer inert. They glowed faintly, not with light but with motion, as if the patterns themselves were shifting, rearranging. She backed toward the ladder. A low moan filled the chamber, not mechanical, not wind, like the earth itself was groaning. She scrambled up, slipping once, scraping her knuckles. When she emerged into the library, Roach was staring at the trap door wide-eyed. His nose was bleeding. "I heard them," he whispered. Greer shut the hatch and ordered it sealed. But the sound did not stop. Over the next 2 days, strange events were reported across Wabrook Middle School. Lights flickered in rhythmic patterns. Security footage glitched at 3:41 p.m., the exact time the McCall boys were last seen. Students complained of whispers in the ventilation shafts. One teacher quit without explanation, after claiming to see a boy sitting in the last row of her classroom who wasn't on the roster and didn't cast a shadow. Greer returned to the police station in a haze, certain now of one terrifying thing. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a containment zone. And something had been disturbed. She reviewed the forensic reports again, especially the soil tests taken from under the gym and the parking lot. One sample contained an anomalous material, organic but unclassifiable. Not fungal, not microbial. It vibrated under observation. The lab had never seen anything like it. Whatever had taken the McCall brothers hadn't killed them immediately. It had used them, through their voices, their memories, their echoes. And now with the spiral broken, it was speaking again. Not from below, but through the building itself. A decision was made. Wabrook Middle School was evacuated. The official story, a gas leak triggered by structural instability under the gymnasium and library. Students were sent home. Staff were told not to return until further notice. News crews circled like vultures, but no one from the district would speak on record. Detective Greer stayed behind. The school, now silent, felt heavier than ever before. She walked the halls at dusk, flashlight in one hand, the old blueprint in the other. Her steps echoed. Locker doors creaked as if breathing. She had one last location to check, a space no one else had questioned, because it hadn't existed in 1995. The new annex, built in 2007, long after the McCall boys vanished. On paper, it was nothing special, a computer lab, staff offices, and a small basement used for storage. But the original plans didn't align. When overlaid on the 1972 foundation, the new annex's basement sat directly above a void, a gap not accounted for in any updated blueprint. She descended the annex's stairwell alone, her flashlight beam flickering. The storage room smelled faintly of old paper cleaning products, and beneath that, something metallic. She found the panel in the corner, a square of sheetrock with different nails, mismatched paint. Newer. Hidden in plain sight, she pried it loose. Behind it, a narrow passage. Stone walls. the kind that weren't in any modern construction. As she entered, her radio crackled to life. "Greer, you copy." It was Officer Riley stationed outside in his patrol car. She clicked her headset. "Go ahead. You still in the building?" "Something's happening out here." "Define something, Riley." "Lights just came on in the gym, all at once. The floodlights. But the breakers are shut off. Maintenance killed the power hours ago." Greer paused. "And that's not all," Riley continued. "There's a voice on the PA system. Real faint. Can't make out words. Repeating something." Greer's heart pounded. "Pull the tapes. Get back up. I'll check this out." She continued down the stone corridor, now sloping downward deeper into the earth. Her flashlight flickered again, and then for a moment cut out completely. In the darkness she heard breathing, not her own, slow, raspy, as if lungs were full of ash. She flicked the light back on, heart racing. The walls were lined with carvings again. More spirals, more interlocked triangles, but these were wrong. The edges were smeared, warped, like they'd been drawn by something that didn't understand geometry. At the end of the passage was another door, wooden, ancient, bound in rusted metal bands. Burned into the surface, the spiral symbol, this time incomplete. She reached for the handle, paused, then pushed. Inside was a chamber unlike anything she'd seen. The walls were covered in mirrors, cracked, blackened, all pointing inward. At the center was a pit, shallow, lined with scorched stone. Symbols carved in a circle around it. In the pit were items, small, childlike, a sneaker, a plastic toy robot, a school folder warped by moisture, and bones, tiny, 2 sets. Greer stepped forward slowly. Her knees weakened. She recognized the toy. She'd seen it in an evidence photo from 1995. Mason McCall's favorite, he'd carried it everywhere. The boys were here. This was where they had ended. She knelt beside the pit, and then she heard it again, breathing, but not from the pit, from behind her. She turned. In the mirror to her left, a figure stood, tall, thin, featureless face. Its arms hung too low. Its form seemed to ripple like oil on water, but when she turned around, the room was empty. Only the mirrors reflected its presence, and then it moved, not within the room, but across every mirror at once, stepping from one to the next, like walking between panes of reality. Greer stumbled back. The spiral on the floor began to glow faintly, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Then came the voices, from the walls, from the PA system above, still connected somehow. "You looked. You listened. You opened it." A mirror shattered. Then another. The breathing intensified, and the voice split, now layered, overlapping. Mason's voice. Derek's. Corrigan's. Greer's own voice repeating her own words back to her. The chamber pulsed. Greer drew her weapon, trembling. The figure stepped forward out of the final mirror, its feet not touching the floor, its body rippling with static distortion. She fired. The bullet passed through it and struck the far wall with a pop of sparks. The creature tilted its head, not aggressive, curious. She backed toward the door, but it shut on its own ceiling with a grinding screech. Then the lights went out. She was alone, except for the sound of her own voice whispering over and over in the darkness. "Don't open the other door." But it was too late. The spiral had been broken, the containment breached, and something old had remembered its name. The next 72 hours were chaos. The police lost contact with Greer after her last radio call. When backup arrived at Wabrook Middle School, the building was locked from the inside. No one answered knocks or shouts. The security system, a relic from the early 2000s, registered motion in multiple wings simultaneously, though the heat sensors showed no human presence. Then the library lights exploded. Every single one. Glass rained down onto empty bookshelves, and in the dust below, the shattered bulbs. Staff later found boot prints, barefoot, small, and charred at the toes. Greer awoke not with clarity, but with silence. She was still in the chamber of mirrors, but something had changed. The pit at the center was empty. The bones, the artifacts, gone. The mirrors had repaired themselves, smooth now, whole. But the reflections didn't match the room. In each one, the chamber looked slightly off bookshelves behind her, where none existed, or a second version of herself crouched and crying in the far corner. Sometimes the mirrors showed a young boy standing just behind her shoulder, only there was no one there. Her flashlight flickered again. The battery was dying. She pressed the door, now unlocked, and emerged into the tunnel. It no longer sloped, it rose. Somehow the angles of the place had shifted. Every step felt wrong, like walking uphill in a dream. The walls now pulsed softly with a dull red glow as if lit from within. The spiral was no longer dormant. It was awake. Greer's radio crackled with fragments. "Dative Greer, do you copy? Please respond." She tried to answer. No signal. Still, she moved forward. As she rounded a corner back toward the storage basement beneath the annex, she heard something unmistakable. Laughter. Childlike. Familiar. Mason and Derek. She froze. Then a voice called out, soft, echoing off the stone. "You took too long." She burst through the final doorway and found herself not in the storage room, but in the old gymnasium. Or rather, something wearing the gym's face. It was darker, warped. The walls bowed inward. The bleachers were folded into impossible angles, and the basketball hoops dripped black strings like torn spider webs. In the center of the court, a spiral had been carved, this time into the floor itself. It pulsed with red light, and standing within it, back turned to her, were the McCall brothers. Whole, alive, unchanged. "Mason," she whispered. They turned. Their faces were pale, their eyes too wide. Their mouths opened, and a third voice spoke from within them, layered and ancient and wrong. "The door is open. You cannot close it now." Greer backed away. They stepped forward, still speaking in unison, their mouths stretching far past what was natural. "The spiral returns to feed. Your world will unmake itself in silence." Then the air shimmered. Time staggered. Greer's vision split reality, folding like pages torn from different books. The gym twisted, reshaped itself. The wood floor crumbled to stone. The spiral on the ground began to rise, coiling upward like a living thing. And from its center, the faceless figure emerged again. Only now it wasn't faceless. It wore Greer's face, her voice, her memories. It smiled. "You carried it out," it said. Like a key inside a wound. She tried to move, tried to scream, but her body didn't respond. Instead, the world collapsed inward, and everything went dark. When she came to, she was in a hospital bed, blinding white light, the beeping of heart monitors. A nurse leaned over her, startled to see her eyes open. "You're safe," the nurse said. "You've been missing for 3 days." Greer blinked. Her throat was dry. Her muscles ached. "What happened to the school?" The nurse hesitated. "It's gone." Greer frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" "The building collapsed. Sinkhole, they think. Structural rot. The police pulled you out from the rubble near the annex." She shook her head. "No. The boys. The spiral. The mirrors." The nurse smiled nervously. "You were found alone. No one else was inside." Greer didn't respond. Later, she watched the news. Footage showed the school cordoned off with yellow tape. Emergency crews. Engineers puzzled by the foundation's total failure. The parking lot had split in two. A piece of blacktop had peeled back in the shape of a spiral. They said it was coincidence, a natural formation. Detective Greer knew better. In her bag, now resting beside her hospital bed, was the VHS cassette labeled Mason, 10/2/95. She hadn't turned it in. She hadn't told them it existed. Because part of her knew it was still listening. Recovery was an illusion. Detective Greer left the hospital 2 weeks later. The department gave her a brief leave of absence, citing mental exhaustion, post-traumatic stress, and environmental exposure. That last one was vague, deliberately so. No one wanted to say what they suspected. No one dared ask what she had really found beneath Wabrook Middle School. She returned to her home outside town, locked the doors, and blacked out the windows. The VHS tape stayed hidden. She watched it once, only once. Mason's face staring back, whispering the same words again. It wears people, but it's not a man. After that, she locked the tape in a fireproof safe, buried it beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, and told herself it was over. But the spiral had not finished with her. It began with subtle things. The mirror in her hallway no longer reflected her movements perfectly. Sometimes her reflection blinked out of sync. Occasionally it smiled when she did not. Then came the voices. In the vents, in her sleep. We were so cold. Why did you wait? You opened it. One night she woke to find her phone vibrating on the nightstand. No number on the screen, just a timestamp 10:02 p.m. The same time Mason and Derek vanished on October 2nd, 1995. She answered it, static, then breathing. Then her own voice whispered, "We never left." She threw the phone across the room. Outside headlights swept across the window. A car idling at the edge of her driveway. She approached slowly, weapon drawn. There was no driver. Only a cassette tape sitting on the driver's seat marked in smudged ink. "Greer, watch this last." She took it inside hands, trembling. But she didn't play it. She couldn't. Because deep inside, she understood now. This wasn't about the McCall brothers. It wasn't about Wabrook or Corrigan or KSR Holdings. Those were threads. Human hands in a machine they never built. This was about what lived underneath. The thing in the mirrors. The spiral in the stone. It had been waiting for someone to open the door. To speak its name. To carry it out. And she had done exactly that. One final report was filed in the Wabrook Police Department before Greer resigned for good. It was short, unsigned, and typed without a date. The contents were as follows. ARA Site M05 Containment Failure. Subject is presumed breached. Entity displays mimicry, distortion, and temporal manipulation. Human contact results in elevated hallucination, time gaps, and psychic residuals. Symptoms include auditory hallucinations, mirror inversion, pattern recursion, spiral fixation, temporal memory loss. Current status entity now unbound from initial containment site. Mobile, potential hosts unknown. Recommendation: cease investigation. Destroy all remaining analog media. Do not attempt recontainment. Do not engage. End transmission. The report was found in the evidence locker weeks later, unsigned. The only trace Greer left behind was a spiral drawn in dust on her desk. Elsewhere in a different town, a school janitor pulled open an old maintenance hatch he'd never seen before. Strange that it wasn't on the blueprints, but the concrete seemed hollow, and behind it, there was a faint hum. He leaned down, flashlight trembling, and from beneath the floor, something breathed. "Waiting,"